this talk is going to be about adversary emulation, which is probably one of my favorite topics, especially in InfoSec, especially if you're offensive, right? Because you get to play the role of an adversary without actually going to jail, which is a pretty cool gig, if you ask me. And for this talk, we have Samuel, aka Valken K, on Twitter. He's a red teamer with Cognizant and also an US Air Force vet. So thank you for your service. And with that, go for it.
Thanks, George. I appreciate it. Yeah, as George mentioned, my name is Samuel Kimmons, and I'll be talking to you today about adversary emulation. So adversary emulation is an extremely important topic to me. I'm very passionate about it, and I feel that it fits into security operations, not only in purple teaming, but in the bigger picture, right? And it can provide so much value to an organization. But before I get completely into the weeds, I just wanted to give a big shout out to SANS and the advisory board and my mentor and all the attendees for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Thanks. All right, so a quick overview of what I'll be covering. So the agenda for today. I'll give you a quick intro, the classic who am I? I'll jump into an introduction to adversary emulation, and then the types of emulation. And yes, I believe that there is more than one type of emulation, and we'll dig into that later on. And then we'll find out where adversary emulation fits into security operations. We'll talk about threat intelligence place in adversary emulation. You will hear me saying that over and over again, because that's very important for adversary emulation. It is one of those key ingredients that make adversary emulation so special and so effective. And then I'll talk about emulation for detection testing and purple teaming, since we are at the purple teaming summit. And so adversary emulation fits perfectly in that category. And then we'll talk about emulation as a training tool. And I'll cover the various aspects of different types of emulation that can work for both detection testing and training. And then I'll give you some resources, no matter what level you're at security-wise, like maturity-wise for your organization, whether you're ready for a full-fledged purple team, as we've seen in previous talks with the maturity model, or if you're completely way down the road, you have a fully efficient SOC and red team, how you can start leveraging adversary emulation. And like I said, even if you're at the very beginning stages where you just have a defensive team, I'll give you some of those tools as well. And then I'll wrap up the talk with my final thoughts and some links to help you out. So let's go ahead and get started. So who am I? My name is Samuel Kimmons, as I mentioned. I'm currently a red teamer at an organization called Cognizant. I was previously at an organization called Recon InfoSec, where I was the adversary emulation lead. And I focused 100% on replicating adversary TTPs and their malware and their C2 capabilities. And before that, I was at the United States Air Force. I started out as a sysadmin, help desk type person, got lucky and moved my way up to SOC analyst, and then eventually to pen testing and red teaming. And so in between the SOC analyst and the pen testing red teaming portion of my time in the Air Force is where I really started to dive into the idea of purple teaming and adversary emulation, where it kind of really ticked like, this is a very important function that needs to happen. And not only in giant organizations like the United States Air Force, but even small businesses who can take advantage of these types of activities. And I like to fancy myself as a purple teamer and an adversary emulator. You can find me on Valken, on Twitter at Valken_K, and then on GitHub at /ValkenK, where I'll link you to a repo later on that will kind of help you get started. And then let me go ahead and throw out the classic disclaimer. Thoughts and opinions expressed in this talk are my own and do not represent those of my employer. So introduction to adversary emulation, you might be thinking, you've probably heard this over the last year or two, it's becoming more popular, just like purple teaming, but we know that purple teaming has actually been around for a while. It's just the industry is finally adopting the terminology for it. And so it's not just red teaming, but I believe that adversary emulation falls under the broader scope or the broader picture of offensive security. And this is really cool because even if you don't have a red team and you have a pen testing team, yes, they are different. If you have a pen testing team, they can serve as the adversary emulation focus, because the act of adversary emulation is being as true as possible to threat intelligence when conducting offensive operations. Just like you have with threat hunting and defensive types of activities, intelligence-driven operations is key for adversary emulation, because without adversary emulation or without threat intelligence, you don't really have adversary emulation. You have another type of emulation, which I'm going to cover. And so I mentioned there are two. I think there are two primary types of emulation. To dive a little more into the adversary emulation side, replicating unknown threat actors' TTPs and behaviors based on threat intelligence. That's like the key line you need to take away from this, from learning about adversary emulation. And I'm gonna give you a cool formula later on to kind of guide you in the right direction for that process. And so I always like to mention this because I saw this in a blog post, I believe, from the previous director of the Walmart red team. He called red teams basically copycats to an extent when they're conducting types of emulation, because we can only technically emulate a threat actor to a certain degree. We can only do it based on the available threat intelligence, whether you have closed source intelligence or open source intelligence available on an attacker's kill chain. And that's always conflicting, because if you're trying to do complete adversary emulation, you're thinking, oh, I have to be 100% accurate 100% of the time. Honestly, it's probably not even necessary to get to 100% accurate when it comes to adversary emulation. You want to get as close as possible, but there will be variations. So an example is if a threat actor uses a particular type of malware and there's only a small amount of information available on that piece of malware or that payload. So when you're developing a payload to replicate it, you may be able to replicate some of its behaviors, but not completely all of its behaviors, because we simply don't know what all the malware is capable of. And another interesting thing is if you're going through an adversary emulation exercise and you have some good malware analysts, they may be thinking like, oh, threat actor A uses this type of programming language to build this payload, or we don't know what type of programming language they use. So in that case, your offensive team or whoever's developing these scenarios or the malware replication may have to use what they're comfortable with, right? So if it's built in C++, or if we don't know if it's built in C++, and we happen to write it in C#, there will be some differences on the forensic side, but we're able to almost replicate all of the behaviors. And that's what we're really aiming for when we talk about adversary emulation, is getting close as possible to that threat intelligence. And so for the second type of emulation, and this one I find very interesting, I call it threat emulation. It's been called threat emulation before. You can probably refer to it as almost adversary simulation, because you're not targeting a specific threat actor in your activity. You're more focused on emulating TTPs. And this can come in handy when you're wanting to focus on testing detections for specific threats and not necessarily for a specific threat actor. A cool way to do it, though, is to take a group of threat actors and find out, hey, they use this TTP for lateral movement. So while we're not focused on emulating one of those particular threat actors, we're kind of grabbing the broader cluster of threat actors and emulating a specific TTP from them. And so each of these have their ups and downs, right? They serve different purposes and can be different, can require different types of resources, as in development time. So where does adversary emulation fit into security ops? So you've seen the classic security ops broken down into processes, people, and technology. For today, I'm only going to focus on the processes and the people side of security operations, because I believe that the methodologies should be solid regardless of the tool set or the tech stack you're using. And those should be able to transfer once you learn the new syntax, if you're thinking on kind of the hunting or the analysis side. So the processes side of security operations, processes need development, testing, and refining. And in my mind, adversary emulation fits into this picture through the form of purple teaming, because by using purple teaming with adversary emulation, we not only are using the threat intelligence driven operation methodology, but we're also giving the opportunity to the defenders or the analysts to test and refine those processes, those response procedures. And this is very valuable because now we don't have to wait for your quarterly red team or your consultants to come in. You could focus on running a small form purple team using adversary emulation and very closely replicate those threat actors' TTPs. But obviously this can be resource intensive, so keep that in mind. So on the people side of security operations, people need ways to improve their skills and test them. And the reason I bring up adversary emulation for this particular portion of security ops is because through these types of exercises, we're going a little further beyond the classic red versus blue mentality, where we're going at each other's throats, but it brings up kind of more of the sparring partners type of feeling when you do the red versus blue, because honestly, the red team is training the blue team for the real fight. And by running these adversary emulation exercises, you're giving your defenders or your analysts real-time exposure to a potential adversary's TTPs. And this is great because during these exercises, they get exposure to these actions, these TTPs, the behaviors. And when they actually see it in the real environment, they're not stunned, right? They're not questioning what to do. They have their processes refined, and now they've had exposure to these TTPs, and they can kind of figure out what's going to happen next or what actually is taking place in this attack. So you may be wondering, so which type of emulation is the right one? So this will depend on what your goal is, right? So you need to determine, is this for the processes side or the people side of security ops? And the kind of the formula for success when I think about it is you want to ask yourself 3 questions. You want to think of, are you trying to detect or defend against a specific threat actor's TTPs or behaviors? In this case, we might lean more towards adversary emulation because we're focusing on that threat intelligence side and wanting to target a specific threat actor's actions and behaviors and TTPs. And then the second one, are you simply wanting to improve your detections against general TTPs? In this case, threat emulation might be the key because you're not focused 100% on threat intelligence, right? You're focused on the broader picture of a technique. Like, I just want coverage for this specific technique because, according to Red Canary's report, it's one of the hottest techniques right now, leveraged by many different actors. And then we move on to the third question. Are you wanting to train your defenders? And if that's the case, you can apply a variation of these questions to this scenario. So for example, if you're wanting to train them against particular types of lateral movements, you can leverage the threat intel portion from number 1. And then you can also sprinkle in some number 2 general TTPs to accomplish the objectives of the scenario, all while giving your defenders or your analysts exposure to these types of actions. And so once again, I've mentioned threat intelligence several times. Where does it fit into these questions, or where does it fit into adversary emulation as a whole? And I believe that threat intelligence is one of the most important pieces of adversary emulation. And so you can't accurately replicate a threat actor without some form of threat intelligence. And think back a few slides when I said, you don't have to be 100% true to the source, but you want to get as close as possible. And I'll kind of reiterate that again. Like, if you can replicate their command line activity, but you can't replicate their specific method of C2, that is fine. If your goal is endpoint analytics, endpoint detections, that is fine. But when it comes to saying you want to replicate their C2 functionality because you're focusing on the network side artifacts, then you'll need to be as accurate as possible on that side. And then if you want to kind of bring in the full scope adversary emulation exercise, you want to get as true as possible to all components of the kill chain that are available through threat intelligence. And by using that, it allows us to get as true as possible to their actions. And one of my favorite pieces of this is when you're emulating an adversary who is known to target your organization. So for example, you work in the finance industry and your offensive team is emulating a threat actor known to target that industry. It only provides more credibility and more sustenance to your actions because you're driving home the importance of these TTPs, like why we need to detect them, why we need to be able to respond to them accurately, and can we refine our procedures and our methodologies around similar behaviors. So emulation for detection testing and purple teaming. And then this, of course, applies to both threat emulation and adversary emulation. So I'll give you kind of a quick overview of my view of the purple team methodology, and I'm sure this is very similar to plenty of other models going on out there. So we'll start out by selecting a TTP or an adversary TTP. You see we can use adversary emulation or threat emulation for this cycle. All teams will formulate a plan of action. They'll execute their plans, remain in constant communication, because communication is key for purple teaming. They'll validate whether it was successful or not. If they had a detection or if they didn't have a detection, then we can feed that back into the cycle and run as many times as needed. So to kind of break that down a little further, let me give you a more detailed example using the adversary emulation approach. So we've selected a TTP from a report where a threat actor or their piece of malware uses a lateral movement technique via WMIG, because this APT is known to target our fictional organization. So we'll focus on that. And the development side, this is where the resource intensive piece comes in for the offensive side, and possibly for the defensive side, depending on how much of a signature they need to develop or detection mechanism. So the offensive team will leverage threat intelligence to develop that TTP, and so will the defensive team. All teams will execute their plans. That means offensive team will execute that action. The defensive team will execute their response procedures if there is a response action available. And then we'll move on to the validation stage. This is where you find out if, first off, was the TTP executed successfully or was it blocked? And then on the defensive side, was it detected or was it blocked? Was it mitigated at some point in the kill chain of that TTP? If it was detected, we can move on to the next TTP. So we can move on to the next purple team cycle, depending on how many iterations you want to go with different TTPs. But if it wasn't detected, like I mentioned, we can put this TTP back at the beginning and restart the cycle. So a constant feedback loop of communication and execution is one of the best ways to refine those detection mechanisms. And you're probably thinking, this sounds very resource intensive. And I'm not going to lie, it can be. If you don't have the proper resources or the proper tooling to conduct continuous purple team ops, it can be really difficult, very resource intensive and stressful on both offensive and defensive teams. So you're probably wondering, can this be automated? Yes, it can be to an extent, right? So there are plenty of tools available, free and paid, that allow you to automate the attack side and somewhat automate the detection or the prevention side, depending on what kind of endpoint detection tools you have in place. But the cool thing is you can do this as low budget as possible. If you have an offensive team, once they're done executing that TTP, they can use that same skill set, that same development skill set, to add that to a script of some sort. If we're in a Windows environment, maybe they could add that to a PowerShell script so your defensive team can automatically run that. And then on the more expensive side, if you have a paid product that can execute these actions automatically, that maybe integrate with some type of SOAR platform, that'll allow your defensive team to leverage that capability by continuously executing those runbooks or those playbooks, depending on what type of SOAR you have access to. And this is very beneficial because now your offensive team can move on to the next TTP, at least when it comes to the development or pre-development cycle. So they're kind of getting their ducks in a row, so to speak. And to kind of break down the threat intelligence piece for this adversary emulation situation, so we talked about using WMIG, so T1047 from MITRE ATT&CK, and the link here is on screen. So we noticed that NotPetya, the ransomware, leverages WMIG to propagate throughout or across the network, right? And so I chose this one because it's been used quite a bit, and it may have multiple threat actors using this type of malware. And keep that in mind when you're doing emulation for a specific type of malware or threat actor TTPs. Is it kind of brings in that threat emulation piece where we're leveraging a TTP or a piece of malware that's been known to be used by several threat actors and not simply just one. And that's okay too, because we're still accomplishing our goal for detecting or working on detecting WMIG for lateral movement. And so one of the first links is from Talos Intelligence, great resource for threat intelligence. And we find the actual command line technique in the report. So this is great from both the offensive and defensive side. So the offensive side has very little development that they actually need to do to get this TTP running, maybe a little modification for your organization's environment. And then same thing on the defensive side. They could build detections based on the command line parameters. So the process called create. And then there you go, assuming they have the capability to build that detailed of detection. So could be string-based matches. And this is great for when threat intelligence reports provide this level of information, because we can continuously move on to the next cycle if we have data available. And where things start to get difficult is when you run into situations where you don't have data available and you're kind of, remember I mentioned that 100%, right? So you're going to try to get as close as possible. So if we didn't have the exact command line, we could say, well, we know WMIC can execute processes remotely. Okay, we may not have all the other details, but we can build a command just like that. And so on the least resource intensive way to keep track, right? There are plenty of tools for mapping your purple team engagements and even your red team engagements, like Vector, which has been mentioned a couple times over the past day and a half. But honestly, just to get you started, a simple spreadsheet can save you a ton of time and documentation, because remember, I mentioned communication is key during purple teaming, and documentation is kind of that second piece. If you're not documenting what you've executed or what you want to test, it's probably not going to happen. So a simple spreadsheet like this, where you're documenting the TTP you want to test, does the signature exist? Yes or no? Have we tested it yet? And this can be great because this will inform the next team or the next person who picks up the project. Was it actually tested? And then we can rank it priority, 1 being low priority, 5 being high priority, or opposite, depending on how you want to go with that. And then we can throw in the relevant threat intelligence to inform all parties involved of, hey, this is why we're doing this, because this threat actor has used this TTP, and hey, they like to target our organization. And then, of course, we can throw in the date of projected testing to get things on the book, because without a date, it's just a spreadsheet saying, here's some things we want to test. But if you actually build in like kind of project management into it, then you can have an accurate estimated time of execution and potentially completion. So one of my favorite parts about adversary emulation is using it as a training tool. So we're moving on kind of to the people, but also kind of the processes side of security ops. So developing and running adversary emulation scenarios to give defenders exposure to near exact copies of threat actors and their TTPs. And I mentioned this before because it's really important, because when I was a SOC analyst, when I saw a new TTP or a new behavior in an environment, I was just like, I'll go do my research, of course, but it would have helped if I had exposure to something like this beforehand. And I know that plenty of trainings and CTFs are available, which is why I mentioned, you may be thinking, what kind of events can I attend to get this exposure? A lot of security companies offer public and private training opportunities, and these can range in cost and range in what they expose their defenders to, TTP wise and behavior wise. Of course, there's CTFs. I'm a little biased because I was at Recon InfoSec, and OpenSOC was one of the best CTFs I've ever played in. It's one of the best defensive CTFs. Recon runs that at DEF CON every year, so check that out. It gives you great exposure to adversary emulation. And then one of the other great ones, there's a couple of them, I'm gonna mention a couple of them. Another great one is Boston SOC, because they do a great job of making that data set attainable through their tool. Of course, they're using Splunk, but it's still great exposure because, like I mentioned before, the methodology should be there, right? Your investigative methodology or your analysis methodology should be there and not too focused on the tool itself. So bravo to Splunk on that awesome tool. And then, of course, SANS NetWars, one of my favorites, because it gives you exposure to a broad scope or a broad amount of techniques. And while it's not completely focused on exposing you to adversary emulation, I believe that some of the TTPs or the techniques used in there, you can actually pick those up and kind of bring into your analysis steps. And there's probably hundreds of different CTFs. If you have a couple that you like that can give you exposure to kind of offensive tooling, please drop them in Slack and I would love to check them out. So my favorite slide, because this is where I can really help you get started. So let's talk about labs when it comes to adversary emulation and kind of that detection testing methodology. So one of my favorites is Detection Lab. This is a great resource for anyone that doesn't have a massive amount of computing resources, because it allows you to spin up a small lab. I believe it has a domain and allows you to do log analysis, and you can run some attacks in there to really analyze those. Keep in mind that when you do download this, it does take a while depending on your internet connection, so keep that in mind. And then another one that's been mentioned quite a few times over the past day is Splunk's attack range. Another big shout out to Splunk and their research team. They're always adding new content to this, and it gives you that realistic exposure to TTPs, because they like to integrate Atomic Red Team in there as well. So check that out. But kind of on the lower end budget side, or if you want to do something kind of custom, honestly, a few virtual machines and a log analysis tool is one of the best ways to get started. So 2 Windows 10 machines and analyze some PCAP, analyze some Windows logs or sysmon logs, depending on what you have access to. And that's one of the best ways to just get your hands on it and get started. And so you're probably wondering, so, okay, these are the defensive side really, and a little bit of the offensive side. I want to focus more on getting tools for the offensive side. So we have Atomic Red Team from Red Canary. The developers are extremely active and always adding awesome content. I encourage you to go check out their Slack. They're always super helpful. It's one of my favorite tools to do kind of quick detection testing, and you can add in your own atomics. You just got to modify some YAML. And then Caldera, very similar, but not quite. It's from MITRE. It allows you to build a binary and then execute commands through that binary. So kind of how you would with common C2 frameworks, where you would drop a payload or a beacon like Cobalt Strike, and then you would run commands from there. It's not meant for offensive engagements, but you can use it for detection testing capabilities. And then custom development. This is where I mentioned you have your offensive team, maybe even your defensive team, depending on what resources you have, build out tools to get you started in this. And then I have a script on my GitHub on my home lab area that will automate the setup of sysmon and winlog beat. And then I used Cyber War Dog's Help project for my elk stack. So the script will essentially just install everything for you, all the config files, and then it'll ask you an IP address to start forwarding logs to. Great way to get started. I use it all the time when I'm looking to set up a quick range for some TTP testing. And then more on the threat intelligence side to get you started. MITRE attack mentioned 100 times over the last day, could probably be mentioned 1,000. We never get enough of it because it's such a great resource. I encourage you to go check it out if you haven't. And then public threat intel from the various security vendors. So Malpedia is probably my favorite for this, because you essentially go to Malpedia, you type in what you're looking for. I want to look for APTX, or I want to look at a particular type of malware, and it'll bring up all the relevant articles on that particular tool or on that particular malware or threat actor. So I mentioned I was going to give you the formula for adversary emulation, and here it is. So once again, threat intelligence is the key to successful adversary emulation, because without it, you're essentially just doing threat emulation or attack simulation. So step 1, select your threat actor and relevant threat intel. Step 2, develop and replicate the TTPs. This will be your most resource intensive part, depending on how complicated the attack you're replicating is. And then step 3, execute those actions. And keep in mind, this all goes well with a purple team engagement when you're focused on a particular attack or kill chain. So there you go. That's how you do adversary emulation in a nutshell. And I believe I'm exactly at time, I think. So another thank you to Sands and the advisory board and my mentor and all of you listening today. It means a lot for this opportunity. But I kind of want to leave you with some final thoughts. Adversary emulation can help improve the overall security posture of your organization through testing and validating capabilities, or simply improving the people behind the processes, because the people are the most important part, because the tools change and the processes can change, but the people, those are the ones who need to up their skills in order to maintain a grasp on the threat landscape today. Thank you.
That was fantastic. So spot on. I was messaging you on Slack, like, how have we not met before? Like, we're on the same wavelength here as far as adversary emulation and the value that it brings. Your Slack channel is popping, by the way, lots of questions. I think I want to ask one. I answered it already on the Slack just to provide them an immediate answer. But the question is around using the same tools as a real threat actor. What is your opinion on that? Do you need experience reverse engineering these tools to repurpose them, or using your own tools or open source tools?
Yeah, so that's a great question, George. And I mentioned it in my talk, you want to get as close as possible to that 100% real world threat actor feeling, right? And let's say, because let's be honest, most threat actors use Cobalt Strike these days, right? At least to deliver one of their payloads. If you can get your hands on that for your adversary emulation, go for it. But if you can't afford that because it is expensive, you can leverage free C2 frameworks to replicate those TTPs. It doesn't have to be 100% true to the source. As long as you're executing very similar to those TTPs, sure, you may fall into what I call threat emulation rather than adversary emulation, but you're still giving your team exposure and you're still hitting those TTPs and those behaviors.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I answered something along those lines as well. And there are a lot of open source C2 frameworks out there, so much so that we released a project called the C2 Matrix. There's 70 documented command and control frameworks out there. So definitely check those out.
Yeah, I've never heard of that project before. Just kidding.
It debuted at a SANS summit, so hopefully people have heard of it. And again, like if you're getting started and you don't have budget and you want to play with it, especially in the lab, like check out, like you can look at what the adversary did based on threat intel, and then look at which C2 matches the closest, right? And there's so many out there, right? Shout outs to Empire, Covenant, Mythic, right? Like there's so many, but cool. Awesome presentation. Spot on stuff. So thank you, Samuel. Thank you so much.